On this episode of the End of Tourism podcast.
The Disneyfication of plant medicine. This Disneyfying process in which the whole industry kind of like becomes a Disneyfied version. Again, like this happy place, omnibenevolent. We try to hide as much as possible all the darker aspects of it, the ugly sides of it kind of get tucked away. And we just kind of offer this fantasy wonderland of omnibenevolence, and you're just coming here to heal and to transform, and everything is fine, and there's no risk, there's no danger, there's just a promise, right? Like we're selling kind of like this aspirational promise of healing trauma and so on. I mean, it's a very Disneyfied scene to that extent that it's very sanitized, very hygienized, very incomplete version that we're selling people in order to attract them. I mean, there's a lot of competition nowadays. The ayahuasca industry is global and it's massive. There's like thousands of ceremonies happening in every big city of the world every week. So there's kind of like this need to create this Disneyfied version to keep the competitive edge.
Welcome to the End of Tourism. Conversations on wanderlust, exile, and radical hospitality. A quick reminder that the podcast lives on a gift economy model, which means that anyone, anywhere can listen, regardless of their economic situation. Your gift ensures it stays that way, free of advertisements and members-only paywalls. It allows me to devote a great deal of time to this project, to pay for the software and hardware that makes the podcast possible, as well as all of the production and post-production labor. In order to keep the project fed, you can subscribe by making monthly, annual, or one-time offerings at chrischristou.substack.com, where you'll also have access to my writing on these and other subjects including food culture, psychedelics, media ecology, and myth. You can also support us by leaving a review for the pod on Apple or Spotify, by sharing the episodes with your friends, and by following us on social media via the handle, The End of Tourism. On this episode, my guest is Adam Aronovich, a doctoral candidate in anthropology and communications and an active member of the Medical Anthropology Research Center. A long-term student and researcher of various magico-medical systems around the world, he has facilitated workshops and retreats in the Amazon rainforest and the Mexican coast for almost a decade. He is the co-founder of Hidden Hand Media, a creative agency at the intersection of psychedelia, technology, and society, as well as the creator of Healing from Healing, a social media platform that casts a critical, skeptical, and humorous gaze at healing and transformation culture. Welcome to the End of Tourism podcast, Adam. Thanks so much for being willing to speak with me today.
Yeah, no, my pleasure.
So to begin, maybe you could share with us where you find yourself today and what the world looks like where you are.
That's, a simple question. Usually, maybe the simpler answers, but right now, kind of like the last year or two, I've been bouncing back and forth between Nayarit in Mexico and Los Angeles. So right now I'm in LA for the next month or so, and then I'm back in Nayarit for a little bit. But right now in Los Angeles.
Oh, well, welcome this morning. And I know you mentioned to me that you recently defended your PhD thesis, and I'd like to congratulate you on that alone. It's a huge accomplishment. And I guess, before we get into my questions, I'd like to ask you if there's anything in terms of that you'd like to offer us a little glimpse of in terms of what you've been tending to and perhaps even slaving over the last few years or more.
Yeah, thank you. Basically, I wrote an ethnography. My field is medical anthropology. So I wrote kind of a classical ethnography. And it blends a few different genres within kind of like the anthropological literature. So it has some aspects of classical ethnography, which is just kind of like a little bit of a travel log and observation of certain phenomena that I met on my path. A little bit of critical ethnography, which is kind of like taking a more critical stance towards some of the things that I observe and kind of like problematizing some of them with, some context, with theoretical context. but I think like the most important thing for me was also bring kind of the literary side of it. So my goal from the beginning was to make something that was readable and enjoyable. These were kind of the two
Mm.
parameters. When I was writing the text, I kind of constantly just kept thinking about what kind of public I wanted to appeal to. And, it is kind of like an academic text, but also something that I hope that people can enjoy just for its literary merits. So it kind of like draws from that tradition of ethnographic literature that it's also enjoyable and pleasurable and interesting. And I mean, that at least that was what I was aiming for. I don't know if I succeeded. That's not for me to judge. Obviously, it's for the readers. And yeah, I mean, right now the thesis is defended and everything is fine. And I'm kind of like just try now. Then I guess the next step would be to find a publisher and an editor. That shouldn't be a problem. It just still, I mean, it's still an academic text. So to be publishable as a book for a wider audience, it still would need to be edited to some extent.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean that's where it's at. And
Mm.
I mean the whole text kind of like draws from the years that I spent in Peru in the Amazon rainforest. I was working at an ayahuasca retreat center in Peru for a few years and observing and participating and kind of trying to write an account of what it is that people from the global north seek when they speak about medicine, when they speak about healing, when they speak about spiritual transformation. What is the world of meaning that we draw from? What are the things that we get from it? And what is the impact of all of that in the social envelope, in the cultural context in which it all happens? And I guess kind of like trying to give a different perspective that is not necessarily just hype. I think there's been a lot of hype and fervor surrounding psychedelics and psychedelic plant medicines in the so-called psychedelic renaissance. But I think you spend enough time in the Amazon rainforest and you notice that things are more complex and there's much more nuance and there's important things that need to be unpacked and problematized to some extent. So I mean, I hope that my one of the goals was that it doesn't read kind of like as a pamphlet just to kind of like advertise ayahuasca industry on one hand, but at the same time also not to completely bash it, right? Like it was
Mm.
kind of like trying to find the middle way, highlighting both the beautiful but also the problematic, and kind of like trying to give a complete picture of the hope, the hype, the fervor, and also the darker sides of the whole enterprise.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean
Mm.
it's available if anybody's interested. They can reach out and
Oh,
um,
wonderful.
yeah.
Yeah, well, congratulations on that. I mean, it's sounds like not just a lot of hard work, but really important work, and that's in large part why you've been invited to speak with me today. There's very few voices, I think, in the psychedelic subculture who are willing to take it to task, to do so in a way that that honors the kinds of worlds that we'd like to live in, and still recognizes the fault lines that we've created here in our time. And so I'd like to begin, I guess, creating a bit of context for our listeners in terms of a couple terms that sometimes shows up in your writing and in your interviews. I was elated when first reading your work, especially in the context of psychedelics, to read the word iatrogenic, which
Mm-hmm.
I think anyways, was popularized by the philosopher Ivan Illich in the latter half of the 20th century. And so I'm wondering if you could offer our listeners just a brief foray into iatrogenesis and why you think we might apply it to, I guess, an analysis of psychedelic or healing culture.
Yeah, well, I think in the most simple term, iatrogenic basically means something that is caused by the medical intervention, right? So the iatrogenesis kind of would be, for example, a disease of an illness that is originated or caused by the medical intervention itself. So it's a
Mm.
term that is oftentimes used to critique certain aspects of medical practice that are perceived to cause more harm that they actually, to cause more harm than to heal or cure. And when applied to the psychedelic industry, I think iatrogenesis is something that is very important to understand because, of course, the promise of psychedelics is huge, but the potential risks and damage that they can do to the person are also not negligible. And I think it's something that oftentimes get overlooked. I think in the last few years, there's been a lot of people that have made it a point to kind of like highlight the actual dangers and risks of psychedelic
Mm.
practice, including the iatrogenic component of bad facilitation, for example, right? Or bad providers, or not necessarily bad like in an ontological way, but in terms of unskilled or lacking experience or lacking a wide enough repertoire of epistemic frameworks to help people kind of like sense make and meaning make their experiences, which is I think something that for me is very important and something that I focus a lot, right? Like what kind of epistemic tools we're providing for people to make sense of experiences that are inherently oftentimes, rocking the foundations of our epistemologies and ontologies, which is something that, again, not many facilitators are well equipped to deal with, particularly when we're talking about, let's say, ayahuasca in a traditional context, where the ontologies that from which these medicines originate and feed from are extremely different to the worldviews and ways of understanding ourselves in the world that we're accustomed to. So, we're talking about iatrogenic harm. I think I talk about, I guess, the role that facilitators, providers, supporting staff and cast have in ensuring not only that the experience unfolds properly, but also, again, like just not causing harm or avoiding avoiding risk and damage as much as we can, which is something, again, like, it's something that we're learning along the way collectively as this practice has become more globalized and more popularized.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. And there's another term that you use as well, among others, of course, but almost as a kind of antidote, I think, to iatrogenesis, which is epistemic humility. And on your Healing from Healing Instagram page, there's a small post about it in which you write that epistemic humility is an intellectual virtue. It is grounded in the realization that our knowledge is always provisional and incomplete, and that it might require revision in the light of new evidence. Now, I imagine you wouldn't have posted this on an account dedicated to psychedelic healing culture if you thought that epistemic humility was already prevalent there. So my question is, where do you think the lack of epistemic humility among modern people comes from? And why might it be crucial for those in psychedelic or healing cultures?
These are complex things. I mean, I can give my opinion, which is informed by my
Mm.
observations and my experience in these environments. I mean, psychedelics are remarkable for many things. They're remarkable in a variety of different ways, and one of the ways I think that they're more well, not more, but let's say particularly remarkable is kind of like helping people widen or reconfigure our capacity to process information, to make sense of the world around us, to consider knowledge, how we acquire knowledge, how we make sense of that knowledge, and how we form belief systems based on that knowledge, or how we form just models of how the world works, and what our place in the world is like. I think psychedelics are very apt for allowing people to, at the very least, ask questions related to those domains of epistemology, ontology, and so on. At the same time, right, I think like, for example, if a person goes on a psychedelic experience that is very powerful and gets that experience kind of catalyzes this process of deconstruction of our models of the world and what the world is like, and so on and so forth, which happens quite often. Then there is a interval, right, in that person's life of heightened vulnerability in terms
Mm.
of what other models of the world are there available, right?
Mm.
And this is a moment where a person can very easily have their epistemology hijacked by malware. Let's just call
Mm.
it epistemic malware. Whereas the model of the world that they have prior to it maybe starts dissolving, but then instead of kind of like staying in that space of uncertainty and and non-determination, then it's easy to kind of gravitate towards some other model that just provides easy answers. And then we get into the domain of conspiracy theory, for example, or, conspirituality, which is one of the best words, I guess, that became popularized in the last 5 or 6 years since since the pandemic, right? Like this intersection of conspiracy culture, conspiracy epistemics, and Western self spirituality. That is just kind of like this conjunction of conspiracy culture and self spirituality that is really at the heart of much of the contemporary transformation culture, right? Like all the scene that I mean, what I call really healing culture. I mean, the hyper object, let's say, that I use to kind of think about this thing is healing culture, which includes within it, fragments of conspiracy culture, of New Age spirituality, but mostly focused on self spirituality, right? Which is kind of like this modern really, I mean, I don't know it's a religious movement, but like, the kind of spirituality that really sacralizes the self over everything else, right? Like, I mean, we are our own gods and goddesses, like everything can be found inside, all the knowledge and wisdom that we need is already inside of us, and then so on and so forth. And, there are other aspects of healing culture. But so this moment of epistemic vulnerability, right, when our epistemologies and our ontologies kind of get shaken or deconstructed, is a moment where we're very vulnerable to them being influenced or being fed some other story that is not necessarily in our best interest either. And I think, facilitators, for example, or integration coaches or medicine providers, or any person that is really working with psychedelics, I think bears a huge responsibility in terms of that epistemic vulnerability of the person, right? Like being super hyper aware of what kind of stories we are reproducing, what kind of ideologies, what kind of spiritual precepts, what kind of belief systems we carry with us that then get maybe projected into somebody that is in a very vulnerable state. And I think, epistemic humility to that extent functions as a sort of cushion or sort of antidote. It said like, hey, like we don't have to hurry to attach to beliefs quickly. We're like we don't have to attach, we don't have to hurry to leap, make a leap of faith into another belief system that requires from us kind of like that certainty. If there's, I think for me at least, when I'm working for myself or when I'm working with other people, I think one of the places where I feel most comfortable is actually, kind of like in that indeterminacy of allowing myself and encouraging other people to feel comfortable with the not knowing, with the not making a choice, with the uncertainty of not having to, put a finger on like, oh, like this is exactly how the world works. This is exactly who is in charge. This is this is the structure of all. This is like the new model of the world that I have. But rather like, hey, like maybe let's consider that there's complexity and there's a lot of nuance to these things. So in that moment, for example, when that epistemic kind of deconstruction happens, the person has choices. Right? So on one choice, we can say, well, I want to learn more about the political economy of drugs, or I want to learn more about sociology. I want to learn more about the history of governance. I want to learn more about how the economic system actually works and how finance works and so on, which takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort. It's a lifelong endeavor of trying to understand more and more and more about society and about culture and about politics to gain a wider understanding of, a more precise model of how the world actually works. Or on the other hand, we can say like, fuck that, that's too complex. Okay, it's easier for me to just say, oh no, it's actually, the Jews or the Masons, or there's actually like this huge conspiracy or a handful of people that are in charge of everything that happens, and then just I'm gonna attach to that worldview because it provides me a sense of certainty. So like, well, okay, actually, like I don't wanna learn about all of these complex things. I just wanna attach to that easy answer that is providing me with a different structure that lessens that cognitive dissonance and so on. So, conspiracy culture kind of like jumps in those moments. Spirituality oftentimes jumps in those moments, right? Like the both of them together jump in those moments and kind of like hijack that impulse to actually learn and understand better and just provide you kind of like some easy and perhaps comfortable framework that is not necessarily going to be better for the person or society or the community. Yeah. So I mean,
Right.
it's kind of like been the main concern. Just how do we actually bring that epistemic humility to prevent that hijacking of all of those, not necessarily malicious, but bad ideas that get people
Mm.
very riled up.
Yeah. No, that seems to be the question in our time. How the how. Yeah, I mean it's also just a lot of work, and and not to simplify it because it is an incredible amount of work, but certainly when you have an ecology of oversimplification and reductionism as we do in our times, or at least in the way that I was raised in Toronto, Canada, it's a constant battle to remind oneself that you were bombarded most of the time, and it's largely the bombardment of reductionism is largely unspoken because it's so rooted in the culture, in the language of the culture. Yeah, and so you mentioned also that the nuance and complexity that can come out of psychedelic experiences is also, I think, experienced when people travel to other cultures, for example, from the global north or the global south, to have psychedelic experiences. And so it's my understanding that you spent several years in the Amazon working with a reputable retreat center there. And so, while generally speaking, tourists' expectations and entitlement can often and easily lead to bad behavior, the kind of sensationalism that often comes along in news about tourism. And while it's easy to critique it from afar, I'd like to ask you, Adam, what you saw in your time there in the Amazon in terms of what we might say, or what we might call the lack or absence of epistemic or cultural humility. I'm curious how this showed up either in your own experience or those of the people that arrived as pasajeros down there.
Yeah. I mean, again, like these are. I think none of these things are black or white. I think something that just is important for me to say from the get go. Even though I do bring maybe a critical eye or a critical lens to many of these phenomena, I also I mean I do have a lot of I guess appreciation for the work that is done. With even in retreat centers in the Amazon. I mean, I think there are a lot of complexities and a lot of sides to this, but by the end of the day, I think I do have a lot of appreciation for people who are seeking to heal, for people who are even people who are just experiencing the novelty of like different plant medicines, people that are exploring and traveling and wanting to connect with different mystical technologies or spiritual techniques or exploring other cultures, even if they are not as well informed as they should be. I mean, there's all sorts of different things, but at the end of the day, I think, I do have a respect and appreciation for the for the complex of things as a whole. That being said, I mean, yes, there are many things that can be done better, and that for me, that's kind of like the approach. It's not necessarily like all the ayahuasca tourism sucks and we need to completely abolish and eradicate all of it, but rather like, how can we actually benefit from it the most while still contributing to a healthy culture and healthy social dynamics and diminishing the actual impact that this has in local populations, whether it's economic or social or cultural or, and so on and so forth. One of the I mean, there's all sorts of different angles to it. I think, the ones that for me are more interesting, again, like we've been talking about epistemology, for me, the more interesting angles, I mean, of course, there's, social concerns, there's political concerns, there's all sorts of different cultural issues that come with like the arrival of large groups of people from the global north seeking particular things to places that are poor, places that are to some extent destitute,
Mm.
places that are to some extent under the weight of exploitation for many 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 years and so on. So kind of like there's a lot to be said about cycles of exploitation of resources, whether it's in the Amazon, the history of the Amazon, from rubber to wood to now wisdom, knowledge, and so on. Um, But for me, one of the things that are most salient has to do with what are the stories, right, that we tell people. I mean, this is something that I have focused a lot because for me it's very important. Like when we talk about this, I think in the last decade or 15 years, we kind of like made a lot of progress thinking about set and setting, right? Like this idea that psychedelic experiences don't really happen in a vacuum, but there's a whole lot of context and things to take care of when it comes to both kind of like our personal inner state and landscape, but at the same time also kind of like the context in which the experiences happen, the physical spaces, the music, so on. But there's components to the settings in particularly that I think are not necessarily spoken about enough, and they're definitely not curated or thought about in that way. And that part has to do more with kind of like the narrative or discursive dimension. So, what are the stories that we tell ourselves, and what are the stories that we tell people? What are the ideas that are floating out there in the culture, right? About what ayahuasca is for example, or what is plant medicine, or what is what is these are interesting questions. I mean, if you go to, for example, if you open the internet and you go to ayahuasca retreat centers, there's very, very specific narratives that you're going to see over and over and over, right? Ayahuasca pretty much is a panacea for treating trauma, very, very, very common story that we have nowadays. Like ayahuasca is kind of like this antidote for the root source of all Western affliction, which is trauma. I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying this is the story, right? Like this kind of like this cultural moment where trauma has been posited as the work of Peter Levine and Gabor Mate and Besse van der Kolk and all sorts of different things. It's kind of like see trauma, like childhood trauma in particular, as kind of like the source of everything that we suffer from in adulthood, from anxiety, depression, to addiction, to all sorts of different physical ailments, right? Like this kind of like this idea that there's a psychogenic theory of physical illnesses that manifest in our lives because of things that happened to us when we were children. I mean, all these things are kind of like very, very much well rooted in healing culture as a whole and the psychedelic world in particular. So if you go to the website, then you will see that. You will see oftentimes kind of like those stories of appealing to a public that has been fed that story, that we're all traumatized, that we're all suffering from all sorts of different things, and that the way out of it is to work on our childhood trauma, and the way to work with our childhood trauma is to come and drink ayahuasca in the jungle, because that's the panacea, or at least the very best medicine that we found for it. I'm not saying this is not necessarily true. It can be true in some instances for some people. There's nuance to it, but those are the stories that are floating in the culture. And in order to tell those stories, basically, which in other words, in order to attract clients to retreat centers in the rainforest, there is a need to. There's a few things that need to be done. But one of the things that needs to be done is that there's a need for translating, right, an incredibly complex world of meaning. Like, let's say like the local worlds of what ayahuasca is, how it is embedded in animistic ontologies, the worldviews of the people in the Amazon rainforest that have worked with ayahuasca. Right? Like there's a need to kind of translate those worlds and sell them to potential clients. Now, in order to do so, right, like there's the marketing piece of the thing that they need to appeal to our sensibilities, the things that Western client is looking for in these experiences. So you can't really quite talk about things that are part of the local worlds, right? I mean, the Amazon rainforest, like the animistic, I kind of like generalizing a lot, but talking more specifically, for example, let's say you're working in a retreat center that works with Shipibo people, right? And the Shipibo people, as many Spanish-speaking people, as many Amazonian people, their medical systems, right, are medical systems that are rooted in a particular worldview. The medical systems, their theories of disease, the theories of illness, the theories of diagnosis, their theories of cures, right, are rooted in a particular ontology. Are emergent from that ontology, an ontology that is animistic, an ontology that is relational, an ontology that is based on a very different understanding of what the world is, that what most people in the global north would recognize as their own ontology, as our own ontology, which is more materialistic, more atomistic, more individualistic in that sense. And that has a lot of implications because, for example, for the Shipibo people, medicine and warfare, or medicine and spiritual warfare are not separated domains. They are
Mm,
one and the same thing. In the Shipibo worldview, again, as in many other Amazonian animistic systems, disease, for example, never really happens in a vacuum. People don't get ill just because they get ill, right? If
mm,
everything, from malaria to the flu to grave, life-threatening disease, nothing happens just because. The theory of causation, right, in these medical systems is relational.
mm,
If you get sick, it's because somebody made you sick, right? If you experience illness, it's because somebody in the community of being that you're a part of wanted you to be ill.
mm,
And that reason can be all sorts of different reasons. I mean, there's all sorts of different domains of disease in Shipiro culture, from cutipados to sustos to daños. Okay, but basically, all of these things are relational. And what that means, basically, for the medic, right, for the Shipibo medical practitioner who is singing the disease out of your body, is that he's not only cleaning you or emptying you from affliction, but is actively also engaged in combat against the afflicting entity.
mm,
Every act of curing, every act of healing is also an act of battle, of warfare against some agent that is the cause of your illness, because everything is relational. And for you to get better, there's a need to restore that reciprocity, which oftentimes means like we need to get rid of the afflicting agent and then kind of figure out what happened that that agent wanted you ill. So, for example, I mean,
mm,
this can be pure sorcery or pure magic or pure brujeria, in the sense of like there's somebody who is jealous of you or somebody who doesn't like you for whatever reason, and is just like sending you magic darts and making you ill. But it can be also more subtle ways that are embedded within a um, eco-social way of understanding the world, of how reciprocity actually is enacted in real life, in the sense that you cannot hunt in places where you're not allowed to hunt for whatever reason, right? Because it's not the right
mm,
season of the year to hunt a particular animal, because there needs to be a replenishment of females within a particular species, or you're not allowed to fish in a particular cocha in a particular time of the year, because there's a very acute awareness of the cycles of nature, and people know
mm,
when to fish and who to fish and how to fish, and remembering that in animistic worldview, like the fish and the deer and the bird, like they're all persons, right? They're not just resources to be extracted mindlessly from the rainforest. They're people that you engage with like people, like equals, right? So the fish and the tree and
mm,
the lupuna tree, or the gamitana fish, or the deer, or the majas, or the wangana, like there's a need for engagement in an horizontal, person to person, equal to equal way. So if a person goes and walks under the wrong tree at the wrong time of the day, then there's an understanding that that person might fall ill, because the
mm,
tree is enforcing that illness as a result or as a manifestation of that breach in reciprocity, and like disrespecting an equal. Hunting the wrong people at the wrong time of the year is a cause of illness, because there's a breach in that understanding of reciprocity, of you are my equal and I have to respect you in that sense, and if not, then I might fall ill. Anyway, there's all sorts of different reasons why a person might fall ill, right? But all of those reasons are relational. So the healing is also relational, the curing is also relational, the singing is also relational. But to the point, right? Like you cannot really say that in the copy of a retreat center, because you don't want to scare people away. You can't say, oh,
mm.
like you're not going to be working with shamans who are also brujos. You're going to be working in a
Right.
medical system that is both wonderful but also incredibly dark. At the root of it, there's like this understanding of reciprocity that entails constant spiritual battle. You know, eh, when you get to actually experience the work of a Shipibo Onaya, I mean, Onaya is the emic term, the local term that the Shipibo named themselves, the person who know how to work with ayahuasca, right? Like what we probably would call a shaman in a less than ideal way. But when you get to see the work that they actually do, not in the maloca with 25 tourists from the global north, but in smaller settings, in their own communities, amongst their own people, then you can really see the toll that it takes on the person, the actual damage from the spiritual warfare. I mean, again, and I'm not making an ontological assertion here that these things are ontological real in the sense of like, there's a this is always tricky to talk about, right? Like kind of have finding the balance between being respectful and open-minded about the understanding of the world of different cultures, but at the same time, this is where the epistemic humility comes in very handy for facilitators, right?
Mm.
For example, the last thing that you want to do as a facilitator is to allow a person who came to an ayahuasca retreat to leave the retreat now convinced that their illness is due to them being haunted by a spirit or something. Like, I mean, this is something that I've seen many times happen where facilitator takes a pasajero, facilitator takes one of the participants in the ceremony to talk to the shipibo. There's a mistranslation of whatever the shipibo was saying, and then the person is communicated back that their depression or their anxiety or their cancer or whatever it is that they're ailing is actually stemming from curse that somebody put on them
Mm.
or some sort of jealousy or envy, or there's a clash in understandings of causation. There's a clash in understanding of how things happen and what it is needed to get rid of them. And there's a lot of room for iatrogenic damage in those interactions if we're not able to navigate properly the not only the translation but also the cultural translation and also the space for epistemic ambiguity in
Mm.
explaining to the person like, hey, like, this is a particular worldview, this is a particular way of understanding things. We're working within this system, yes, but that doesn't mean that every person has to completely attach themselves now to that belief system, which is something that happens quite a lot, right? Like many of the facilitators in the Amazon rainforest kind of like learn, study, with Shipibo healers within a Shipibo framework, and then they become extremely religious, extremely
Oh.
attached to those particular belief systems, and then they reproduce those things in a way that perhaps is not ideal either. There's something that I mean, it's a concept that I write about a lot in my book, ontological caricatures, right? Like
Mm.
this idea that as much as we would like to try and translate worldviews that are as foreign as, let's say, a Shipibo animistic relational framework can be for me, right? That translation is always going to be reductive. It's always going to be incomplete. It's always going to be a caricature or something that I may approximate an understanding of, but I can't quite articulate in the same way that an actual Shipibo person who was born in the rainforest, who was raised within that framework, who trained their brain with the perception, right, of this jungle life and relationality and so on. I mean, there's always going to be a massive distance, even between the most observant and well-intentioned external researcher trying to understand that world. There's always going to be a distance between him or her and an actual person that grew up within that worldview and trained within the worldview all the time. So our best attempts at translations are always going to be caricatures, and
Mm.
what we're selling people are always going to be those caricatures. And the caricatures not only
Mm.
because they're incomplete or low resolution, they're caricatures also because when that process, when the incentives of marketing kick in, we're also stripping away those caricatures from all their complexity because we're basically sanitizing them, right? Like we want to wash away all the darker sides of it. We don't want to put the word brujeria in our website. We don't want to talk about
Mm.
the occult sorcery that is inherent to those interactions, right? Like we want to kind of sell a sanitized version where the spirits of the plants and the Shipibo healers, are basically omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omniscient, kind of like, saint-like figures that are only working for our benefit for some reason, right? Like the plants of the Amazon, like really have it as their main goal to heal every foreigner that comes to the jungle because they're just omnibenevolent and so on. So, this is something that almost pretty much every website or every Instagram account of a retreat center or the copy or the email copy of the people who are working there. one version of another of an extremely reductive, extremely sanitized, extremely hygienic sort of caricature that sells a product that is meant to appeal to a very wide audience that bears little resemblance to what actually is the belief system, the worldview, the epistemology of the local communities that are working, with those plants, that are offering those services, that are being impacted by this meeting of cultures, whose culture, whose belief systems, whose ontologies and epistemologies are being reduced to something that is mostly used as a marketing ploy to attract people to them. But again, like it bears little resemblance to the actual thing. So, this ontological caricature is something that I also have called the Disneyfication of plant medicine, right? Like
Mm.
this Disneyfying process in which the whole industry kind of like becomes a Disneyfied version. And what I mean by Disneyfied is when we say like the attributes of Disneyland, again, like this happy place, omnibenevolent. We try to hide as much as possible all the darker aspects of it, the ugly sides of it kind of get tucked away, and we just kind of offer this fantasy wonderland of omnibenevolence, and you're just coming here to heal and to transform, and everything is fine, and there's no risk, there's no danger, there's just a promise, right? Like we're selling kind of like this aspirational promise of healing trauma and so on. So yeah, I mean, it's a very Disneyfied scene to that extent that is very sanitized, very hygienized, very incomplete version that we're selling people in order to attract them to. And I mean, kind of in this era of globalized psychedelics, is inevitable because you have
Mm.
to, for example, you have to have a unique selling point if you're competing against an increasingly large number of people offering ceremonies worldwide, right? I mean, you say like, hey, why how do I draw people from, I don't know, from Brooklyn or from London or from Sydney in Australia? Like why how do I sell them the idea that it is very important for them to actually come to the source of it, to work in the jungle with actual Shipibo who are very authentic, right? Instead of just joining an ayahuasca circle in their hometown. I mean, there's a lot of competition nowadays. The ayahuasca industry
Mm.
is global and it's massive. There's like thousands of ceremonies happening in every big city of the world every week. So there's kind of like this need to create this Disneyfied version to keep the competitive edge. Does that make sense to you?
It makes a lot of sense, and that was incredible. I have no doubt that you defended your thesis with precision and beauty. Wow, I want to ask about this note that you suggested about, for example, when someone who spends maybe not enough time, but enough time in, for example, a place like the Amazon with a culture like the Shipibo, for example, to gather in the dynamics and even specificities of their culture, perhaps superficially or otherwise, and then perhaps applies them to their own life or experience or illness or health, or even takes it back home with them, for example, to the global north, wherein there's no cultural framework to support that kind of thing, or just people who would even understand, at the very least, what the person is referring to or talking about. I mean, there's definitely, this sense of iatrogenesis that you mentioned. And I'm wondering as well, within, I guess, on a more fundamental and less specific level, if this notion of health and illness as inherently relational, as inherently social, as affecting or even afflicting a quote social body, as opposed to an individual or personal body. When I mean, I've lived here in Oaxaca, Mexico for the last 10 years. I've spent a lot of time in indigenous villages and peered into the indigenous systems or understandings of health and illness here. And they definitely mirror what you're saying in terms of this relational notion. And I'm curious, leaving the specificities of perhaps spiritual warfare that exists in the Amazon aside, how do you think that the understanding or the possibility of conceiving of health and illness in a relational context might be a kind of sobering how it might reconfigure our understanding of health and illness in the global north or in the west or among modern people, to the extent that, well, maybe this might help us not have to pry and ply the unconsidered and maybe even incoherent concepts of other people. And I want to say incoherent in the sense that you were referring to in the example that you gave about
Yeah.
someone trying to apply it cross-culturally in a way that doesn't fit. Do you think that a relational model might actually uh, help us to, as global north or modern people, to reconfigure the ways in which we come to health and illness, and the ways in which we are healthy in the world or not?
Well, I mean, that's, I think that's my hope. That's what I hope to achieve also as a facilitator in the rainforest.
Mm.
Every retreat that I facilitated, every group that I had the opportunity to talk to while I was there, I always made one session which was basically based on understanding health, not necessarily as a purely individual process, but as a relational process, not necessarily
Mm.
within the framework of animistic agency and so on, but like just very basic things, right? Like, and I think it was surprising in the beginning that people were not aware of these ideas as much as I would like them to do, but also like the reception was very good all the time because there were things that just clicked in people's minds. For example, again, like when you're selling a story of individual transformation and individual healing, I mean, all the healing culture is extremely individualistic in the sense that it kind of like pretends to form communities on the world, but all the interventions, all the understanding of what it means to be happy and healthy, spirituality, like are extremely hyper individualistic because they're emergent from overarching kind of like neoliberal culture that very much takes the individual as the main and only unit of analysis most of the time, right? So for the most part, what it means to be happy and healthy is an individual process, right? Like
Mm.
I have my trauma, I go, I drink ayahuasca, I process my trauma, I develop better habits and so on. I mean, so on and so forth. But it's always kind of like individual transformation, individual healing, individual transformation. There's a mantra, right? There was a mantra at the place where I worked with, sort of a mantra that was repeated pretty much by every facilitator to everybody that came. Your individual healing and transformation is the best gift that you can offer the world. That kind of like sounds right and sounds true, and it may be in that sense. Like it is very important for each individual to do our own work, as it were. Like we have to do our work so we can actually heal, transform, and then have an impact on the world. But there's also kind of like a very navel gazing culture around that thing where the only thing that matters at the end of the day, I mean, you can very easily interpret that saying, right? Like your individual healing and transformation is the best gift that you can offer the world. That can very easily be skewed towards what actually happens in the field most of the time, which is complete devaluation, let's say, of any sort of approach to health, well-being, happiness that is not rooted on my own individual process, that is not encapsulated within my own individual psyche. So we kind of just become passive consumers of retreats, of techniques, of supplements, of classes. But it's kind of like, again, like we're once again kind of like falling into the cycle of individual consumption, whereas we at some point hope that we will escape the matrix just by putting ourselves through the proverbial dishwasher, the proverbial kind of like, just like once more and once more and once again, and another retreat and another workshop and another class
Mm.
and this is the supplement that is going to, or this is the thing. So when I had a group, I kind of like would very explicitly try to deconstruct that idea and illuminate the way in which actually health is inherently relational, right? And individual health is inherently connected or related to the health of our communities, and how my individual health is inherently connected to the health of the society that I live in, and the culture from which I feed, and the environment which sustains me in all sorts of ways. And when you talk about these connections and you make them explicit, a lot of people will be like, "Oh yeah, well that's pretty obvious," But,
Mm.
but the truth is that it's not that obvious in the day to day when a person is still self-absorbed into this vortex of individualized interventions, right? When you go to a place like the Amazon, for example, and you dig a little bit into the actual what's actually happening there, and you contemplate the ecological catastrophe that the Amazon is nowadays, right? Like
mm,
the rivers are dead. I mean,
mm,
there's all sorts of different things that are happening. There are really catastrophic ecological processes that are having a massive impact in the health of communities and individuals. If the rivers are polluted with oil because of the oil companies that are extracting oil in the Amazon and then just dumping the pipes or whatever, not never ever really fixing the pipes in the rivers, and the rivers are polluted beyond any practical use for people, and the indigenous and mestizo riverine people that live alongside the banks of those rivers are using that water to drink from it and cultivate crops and so on, and they're getting sick and they're dying. Then it's very easy to illuminate, right? Like the intrinsic link between environmental health and individual health. If we're drinking polluted water, then we're gonna be sick. We, for the most part, right, in the developed global north have the privilege of not having to think about these things all the time because we're not drinking water from polluted rivers most of the time. I mean, some of us are, of course. There's all sorts of massive problems in the global north as well, but they are not as immediate and they're not as acute as for a lot of people in the global south, including many Amazonian communities that are actually like dying all the time just because of the pollution in the rivers, right? So illuminating the link between environmental health and individual health is one way that we can actually yank the person out of the self-absorbed individual healing process and endless of doing the internal work of changing the locus of healing and transformation from the internal to the external. Sometimes it's fine. It's okay to have one eye inwards and maybe one eye
mm,
outwards, right? So what I tried to encourage people was, as they underwent 7 ayahuasca ceremonies and did all of this personal work and all of this, healing work and transformation work and all digging out traumas and, whatever it is that they were there to do. I'm not saying this with contempt. I'm saying this, I still, maybe with a little bit of irony, but a lot of respect for every single person that actually does this work because it's not easy work. But at the same time, right, we can keep that one eye inwards and do all of that heavy, shitty, emotional, psychological, whatever, self-absorbed, work. But at the same time, one eye outwards. They're like, well, actually, yes. I mean, it is actually becoming much, much clearer that community health impacts individual health in all sorts of different ways, right? I mean, we know, for example, in the West, we're going through massive epidemics of loneliness, massive epidemics of
mm,
alienation. We know that loneliness is a massive problem that is not only a social problem, it's an individual problem. Because when men, I mean, I'm not speaking of men in particular, when men are lonely, when men are alienated, right, when men don't have strong community that binds them to agrees of accountability, of reciprocity, of being a productive member of a community that is encompassing, then we're very easily radicalized. It's very
mm,
easy to radicalize people who are lonely. It's very easy to radicalize people who are alienated. It's very easy to radicalize people who have lost any semblance of community, who are not embedded, who are not accountable by people who love them, and there's reciprocity in those interactions. It's very easy to hijack those minds and say, like, hey, like all of your problems are because of immigrants, all of your problems are because of
right.
Jews, all of your problems are because of somebody that becomes the scapegoat for an incredibly important social cultural problem that then gets individualized in the person, or or cultural issues that are very important. I mean, political issues are very impactful of individual health. I mean, if we have a culture of consumerism, for example, right? I mean, it's one of the examples that I always gave people because it's easy to
Mm,
connect with. If we live in a consumerist culture, whereas everywhere we go, whether we're on the street or whether in the car listening to the radio or just trying to watch TV and unwind, and we're being bombarded thousands of times a day with the same kind of like messaging that is meant to get us to buy shit that we don't want or we don't really need, right? I mean, advertising kind of like relies on one assumption, which is like we have to make that person feel incomplete. We have to make that person
mm,
feel insecure. If we want to
mhm,
sell you the shit that you don't really need or really need one, we want to create that artificial sense of scarcity or that artificial sense of insecurity. So there's a whole culture that thrives on you feeling insecure with yourself, right? So, when a person goes on the street and we see these ads all the time of these beautiful people drinking a glass of wine, or, we hear kind of these things telling us that we're not good enough, we're not pretty enough, we're not rich enough, we're not something enough, then that cultural malware is going to have an impact in our individual health. Because we're not only going to feel more insecure, we're also going to feel anxious, we're going to feel depressed, we're going to feel, again, there's our self-esteem is going to suffer. There's all sorts of things that are cultural issues that are actually also very impactful to our individual sense of health. So what happens when we individualize everything is that we lose sight of those things, right? We lose sight of the need for community as an inherent part of our happiness. We lose sight of the damage that advertising, that consumerist culture does to our well-being, by producing this artificial sense of not being enough. We lose sight of like the massive damage that social media perverse incentives are having on how we are, right? That would keep us trapped into these doom scrolling traps just by basically hijacking our dopaminergic systems. Say like, hey, we're going to feed you rage bait forever and ever to keep you engaged in our platforms. That's a technological problem. That is also a social problem. That is also a cultural problem that manifests as a massive, massive, massive individual issue for a lot of people, right? I mean, I definitely feel that. I mean, I'm definitely, suffering a lot from social media addictions that are structural issues with how these technologies are designed. So, illuminating those links between individual health and community health, individual health, society, culture, technology, environment, and so on is kind of like a very, very important step forward into a healing culture that is able to stop navel gazing and stop that self-absorption into our individual. We kind of like start looking also at structure, because if we're not looking structure, if we're not looking structures, if we're not creating better structures, then we're going to keep having the same results. Right? Like individuals, as much as we want to think that we're kind of like these semi-divine gods and goddesses who are all powerful and so on, I mean, by the end of the day, we are results of the structures that we inhabit. And unless we actually do the work to change structures, then we're always going to be spiraling, like a hamster wheel, chasing our own healing and transformation while the structures that we inhabit are completely broken. There are, in the West, have been always very deep awareness of those things. It's called public health. The pandemic destroyed forever. I mean, I don't know forever. Let's not say forever, but the pandemic did massive damage to the public trust in expertise. Right? Like the response to the pandemic now created Boogie, a monster. It's kind of like this, I don't know what the expression is, but public health, right? Epidemiologists and public health professionals and so on and so forth are now kind of like the enemy of a lot of people. Public health interventions are now seen as fascism. Social determinants of health, which is something, right, that should be at the forefront of any medical understanding anywhere in the world, are now just woke garbage, right? So this understanding that class has an impact in individual health, right? The poverty is one of the most important things to consider when we're trying to make an intervention to get people healthier. It's not only about whether people have access to food that doesn't have red dyes, but the quality of the food that people are able to purchase. I mean, there's all sorts of different things that fall within that rubric of public health, of social determinants of health, of interventions, of health interventions that are not designed just for individual people, but to like really strengthen the health of communities and societies and cultures. So we have different individual results. But all of those things nowadays are kind of like being completely demonized since the response to the pandemic created that boogie monster, and like the anti-woke backlash really saw any sort of attempt to bring forth things about class or race and so on and so forth. I mean, it's going to take a while for that to rebound, I guess. But nowadays we're in a moment in time where all those things are very easily chucked to the side, demonized, and increasingly even criminalized. Public health.
Wow. Thank you, Adam. I guess, in terms of this through line around ecological or social health, I'm curious if whether in your time in the Amazon or elsewhere, or in your studies, either before or since, if the people, now I guess this question kind of runs in two parallel directions. We could speak of the people who operate and own and administer psychedelic retreat centers, and then also the indigenous communities that are employed by them often. In your time there, before or since, uh, was there any consideration as to the consequences of social health for the indigenous communities there as a result of tourism? There's a kind of, I've seen it, I've read it, kind of back and forth debate about whether tourism is now causing more sorcerous attacks or spiritual warfare between curanderos or shamans or villages, or whether it's lessening. There's also the question of the diaspora, the amount of healers from the Amazon who essentially take their skills on the road and spend most of their time in the global north, treating global north or modern people, as opposed to those in the villages, and that there can be, in some places might be, in other places perhaps is, a degree of inequality that is growing either within the villages or between the villages as a result of this tourism. So, I'm sure I'd love to hear your opinion on it, but I'm also curious if you saw any willingness to consider that, not just among the retreat center owners, but also the indigenous communities there in the Amazon.
I mean, I really cannot speak to either retreat center owners or operators or indigenous people per se, but I mean, I can give some observations in terms of this phenomena. When talking about indigenous people, I think also is very important, particularly, I mean, when talking about the Shipibo people, for example, I think it's very important to note that this is not a monolithic voice. I mean, there's no consensus about any of these things. Every person has their own opinions. There's all sorts of different ideas, opinions, and feelings about it. Some people are more radical to either style of it. I mean, I definitely met people who were extremely appalled by the whole thing, and they were very conservative and very protective of their own things and very reticent to give knowledge to gringos and so on and so forth. And I met others that were like all over the place, like free for all, like just come, pay us money, and we will give it. And I think it's important to note not only that it's not a monolithic set of beliefs or ideas, but also that Shipiro people they have a lot of agency within this construct. I mean, it is very asymmetric in the sense that, of course, people from the global north do come with much more resources, money, power, decision making, and so on and so forth, which means that the incentives for the Shipibo populations are fairly strong. I mean, it's very difficult. For example, if a Shipibo healer, the Shipibo Naya gets hired, or he gets the opportunity to be hired by a leading retreat center and go work there for 3 months, I mean, the amount of the payment or the money that he would make 3 months working in a retreat center away from home is something that will be very difficult to say no to, even if that means leaving their communities and their families without their work, which happens all the time. So my cats are jumping around. I think it's the zoomies time. So, but it is true, for example, that many trained onayas are not serving their communities anymore. Okay, both because the majority of the time they're working with us in whether it's in ayahuasca retreat centers or just traveling around the world or operating their own retreat centers. This is something that has happened quite a lot in the last 5, 6, 7 years. Is that many Shipio families who were, let's say, on the first waves of employment in Western-owned retreat centers, they figure it out. Like, hey, we don't have to be employees of anyone. We have, I mean, the knowledge, the skills, the resources are ours. The only thing that we need is our own physical environment and the know-how how to run a business. And to the credit of ayahuasca retreat owners, such as in the place where I worked at, there's a lot of help that is being given, right, to the Shipio families. Like, hey, you worked for us for many years, and now we're going to reciprocate by helping you to create your own dieta centers, whether it's logistically, knowledge-wise, consulting, economically. And now, many of the Shipibo Nayabo that I met in the beginning of my time in the Amazon as labor, as salaried laborers, as employees of retreat centers, nowadays they have their own centers. They attract their own public, which is mostly made out of people that they met working at retreat centers. They created their own clientele. They came up with their own model of how to give plant dietas, and they get a lot of help in marketing by previous guests. They get a lot of social media training by previous guests. I mean, there's a lot of gaps that are bridged just by this intercultural, cross-cultural fertilization that happens all the time. And it's not. I mean, it's neither negative or positive. I think it really depends who you're talking to. I mean, I think as a whole, there's a lot of Shipibo families, a lot of Shipibo practitioners that are now retreat center owners that travel the world offering medicine to people that love the work that they do. Has that increased jealousy, envy, so on? Of course. I mean, it's completely ripped apart many Shipibo communities for obvious reasons. I mean, if you're living a lifestyle that is 4, 5, 6, 7 steps, upward from the median Shipibo income, from the median Shipibo lifestyle, then of course there's going to be people opening eyes on what are you doing and how are you doing and so on and so forth. So there's many internal frictions. There's also been some attempts to regulate those internal frictions in different sort of ways. Shipibo associations of Onayabo got together for the first time a few years ago, kind of trying to provide some guidelines of internal regulations for Shipibo shamans on how to work, where to work, what kind of conditions. I mean, I don't know where they're at now, to be honest. I haven't really followed up on it, but back in the day, they were kind of like trying to come up with ideas that at least some of the money that is sunk into retreat centers comes back to Shipibo communities. Right? Whether it's in forms of school to train younger Shipibo generations, which is a massive problem for Shipibo still today, right? Like the vast majority of apprentices of Shipibo medical systems are not Shipibo. They're Westerners like you and I that come to the jungle, do dietas, they fall in love with the medicine and they want to become shamans themselves. Whereas Shipibo youth are not so, they're not so inclined, right? Like they have the opposite drive. They want to go to the city, they want to go to university, they want to join the Western world because that's what they see as the best path forward. So it's kind of like this different. Kind of like Westerners kind of like going to the jungle to learn ayahuasca, to practice ayahuasca, to eventually provide ayahuasca. Whereas most Shipibo youth are in the opposite direction, getting as far away from it as possible, going to university, becoming accountants or lawyers, or just anything that kind of like brings them closer to kind of like mainstream Peruvian society. Things are changing all the time. I think a lot of, at least from the people that I spend time with, the families that I spend time with in the Ucayali in Peru, like seeing that actually in the last 10, 15 years, there's been such an influx of foreigners. Maybe people do rethink whether, actually learning from their grandparents and practicing the crafts of the families are a better idea. Both there's an economic future in it. There's definitely prestige in it. There's definitely the opportunity for travel. I mean, there's all sorts of different things that are changing very quickly. But, it's again, like it's not a very monolithic thing. I think different people think different things, and for sure, there are things that are pretty universal within Shipibo contemporary Shipibo criticism. Again, which is like how can we channel more resources into our communities? How can we ensure that there's a future for Shipibo youth within the system that is not only gringos, right? Like all these things are kind of like things that get talked about all the time. And I'm sure that there's all sorts of new developments that I'm unaware of that touch on many of these things amicably from their part.
Wow. Fascinating. Thank you, Adam. So I have a strange question. I have a very left field question that I've been wondering about for a few years. So when modern people show up in places like the Amazon or Oaxaca, for example, searching out psychedelic medicines or healing, when they do so as tourists, dropping in and flying out, they often come and go with little to no understanding of their level of consequence on a place. Consequence that is often lost on them because of the short-term duration of their stays, and often because the politics of such things are kept from visitors, as you mentioned a little bit earlier. And so there's this kind of touristic element that appears perhaps inherent in psychedelic retreat centers and weekend weekend warrior ceremonies.
Yeah.
And so if we take these notions of hypermobility, of temporariness, and relative ignorance of, for example, the local culture and history, and if we consider the immense consequence that we have in the places that we visit, do you think that we as humans have the same consequence in the psychedelic realm? Do you think we show up as tourists in the psychedelic realm? And if so, what do you think are the consequences for the psychedelic realm, or the medicine, or the
The
spirits
astral.
of the medicine?
Oh, okay. So you're talking about the astral, the psychedelic realms.
Right. And the
Yeah.
context kind of boils down to a degree of hospitality. If we arrive in a place and we have no invitation, if we have no understanding of the language that the people speak, if we bring no gifts with us, if we just walk in expecting to be
Yeah.
fed, right? If this is sometimes a part of what psychedelic tourism is like, do you think there's a possibility that we also have some adverse effect on the psychedelic realm when we go there in the same way or in similar ways?
Huh. Well, I mean, this is really a conversation for kind of like maybe a post rave state when we're both on mushrooms and smoking a joint. I think speculating about psychedelic realms is very tricky. I think
Mm,
we again like we there's so many assumptions about what those spaces are, who we are interacting with. This is again, maybe again, this is where epistemic humility comes into. I think from my own ideas about what this means have changed quite radically and keep changing all the time. From being a true believer about this space of objectivity when I'm interacting with real essential beings that are ontologically real in front of me all the time, that there's a knowable dimension of relationships that I can cultivate by coming back to these places and meeting these real people as if they were my family. Dieting, I mean, I've dieted quite a lot and kind of very much, I mean, dieting, for if anybody hasn't heard about this concept, it's kind of like the way that many Amazonian cultures, including the Shipibo, kind of like forge these relationships with plant helpers and plant spirits and different medicines through a dieting process that basically kind of like entails isolation, social isolation, and fasting, and a lot of meditation, and creating kind of the right container for focusing on crafting a relationship with one particular plant or one particular spirit. And I mean, I've done that multiple over the course of weeks or months. Sometimes, I've done a few diets, and every time that I do it, I'm kind of like very much drawn into this world of relationships, of like objective, ontological beings that I'm in contact with, that I'm forging relationships with, and then kind of like that kind of fades away, and I fall back into like, well, maybe like there's an ontological primacy to my imagination as opposed to an
mm,
actual realm that is objectively real out there. And I mean, these are very tricky things, and I think this is where epistemic humility kind of comes in. Nowadays, I kind of like, again, like I kind of like learn. Maybe it's a cop out. Maybe it's just my lack of courage to make a to take a stand. But I mean, I feel comfortable saying like, I don't fucking know what's going on in those spaces. Every time that I visit, I'm blown away. Every time that I visit, I end
yeah.
up, in this state of awe and reverence. But at the same time, like I'm not gonna tell you, like this is real, this is not, this is what it is, this is what
Mm,
it's not. I think we're very, very, very far from being able to even approximate any sort of certainty about these states, about these places.
mm,
For me, like it may be that a lot of that is projection from my imagination. It may be that a lot of that is an actual space that I enter while I'm in contact with actual intelligences that are external to me. I think, a lot of people will resonate with both of those things. Maybe there's, maybe people have other ideas that are there. And I think, for me, I don't feel that I need to, I don't feel that I need to convince myself that there's anything particularly, that any belief system is better. I think I'm very comfortable just visiting these spaces without any sort of certainty, and dwelling with it, that uncertainty is fine. But to your question, I mean, I've had experiences, man. I mean, when I dieted Chirix Sarango, I thought it was killing me. Like I honestly was like in the last ceremony that I did. Chirixanango is a plant, one of the master plants in the Shipibo Pharmacopoeia, considered like a very strong, stern, but loving teacher in many ways. I mean, you're not supposed to diet Chirixanango early on your path. It's something
Mm.
that you do after many years, many diets, many, many incarnations of all sorts of different practices. I went into Chirixanango fairly early, and during my last day I dieted it for 1 month. And during the last ceremony, like the closing ceremony of my diet with that plant, I just had an experience where I felt, like something just strangling me, and a very stern entity that was speaking to me and basically telling me, you don't have the respect that you need for this experience. Like basically, like you didn't go into this wholeheartedly, and you're gonna pay the price for it. And then it just kind of started strangling me. Like I felt all of my body breaking and compressing.
Wow.
Like I felt like different parts of my body starting to shut down one by one until it basically just came out to my lungs and my heart. And then just having this voice of like, there's nothing left for you to do. You fucked up. Just let go, And I did. I kind of, well, I fucked up. I went into this experience unprepared, and now I'm paying the price, and it's going to kill me, and I'm gonna die. And I did die, and then of course I re-emerged from the other side with this massive, amount of reverence and awe, and like a newfound respect for this path. I tell this story. I tell this story just kind of like a personal anecdote of, of going into something that I wasn't really prepared for, or that at least I thought I wasn't prepared for. What happened there, I don't know. It was a dead and rebirth experience for sure. Was the spirit lecturing me, and basically, like it was the spirit kind of like just kicking my ass about being unserious, a projection of my own fears, a projection of my own unconscious, an actual encounter with a Chirixanango entity that was just, I don't know. Do I have to know? Probably would be good for me to take a stand. But as far as I can tell, both of those possibilities are true, or possible, and maybe there's many other possibilities that are also. When I was younger, I had a friend. Well, I had many friends. We also did kind of like a lot of reckless stuff with plants and so on. And I remember one time, we smoked salvia. Back in the day, you could buy that in the gas station in all sorts of different countries. I don't know what the status is today. I think you can't anymore because it's a fucking scary thing to do. And I remember one of my friends, just taking a big hit of salvia from a bong and then going into this state, and then just coming out of it with the most livid, terrified expression that I ever seen in a living person. And the only thing that he said, the spirit of salvia appeared to me, and she told me, if you do this ever again, I will kill you.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
and we're like, you know what? Maybe we don't want to mess with this thing again, like all of us. So I don't know. Was that really the spirit of salvia, like just warning him to get up? Was it his own projection of fear and on disco? I don't know. Again, like I think my honest appraisal of these things. Anyone who professes any degree of certainty about ontological and epistemic matters related to the psychedelic experience is either self-deluded or a charlatan. My personal opinion.
Anyone from we'll say, from modern culture or global north?
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to exclude indigenous people because their worldviews match those experiences to some extent. And I
Mm,
think when you grow up with that sort of programming or cultural programming, with that sort of ontological priming, it's impossible for me to say. It's impossible.
right.
I very much respect animistic perspective. I think the world as a whole would be much better off if all of us were animistic to some extent. At the very least, if we had that understanding of reciprocity, of personhood, of respect as equals, as the world, I think, who was it that said this? I think Dave Barry, I think, kind of frame it as an understanding of the world as a community of subjects to be in relationship with, as opposed to
Mm,
a collection of objects to extract from personal benefit, right? Like if all of us approach the world in that way, as a community of subjects, as a thou, Martin Buber kind of gave a distinction, right? Like I and thou versus I and it. the world not as an it, but as a thou, as a you, as an equal. I mean, I think we would be much better off, everybody. So I have a lot of respect and appreciation for animism. I think animism is a much better framework for relating to the world than whatever it is that we have.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you for being willing to share those rather trepidatious stories with us. But I mean, from time to time, you'll hear people in the psychedelic subculture use these experiences or similar experiences, or the quote unquote bad trip, as a kind of metaphor for the psychedelic subculture at large. That whether it was following in the centuries that followed the eradication of indigenous wisdom in the European continent and elsewhere as a result of the Inquisitions or the witch hunts, or whether it was after the madness and destruction of World War II, there seems to be an unwillingness to approach these plants and perhaps certainly even other cultures with a degree of reverence and awe that would properly sit on the throne, I think, of the kind of worlds that we'd otherwise wish to live in.
Yeah, totally.
And that was you basically answered my final question, which was what kind of steps do you think we take going forward in terms of the psychedelic subculture? And this is something you've done for the last almost hour and a half, is proceed with a degree of epistemic humility, practicing it, speaking it. And, I'm deeply, deeply grateful for that. I would just say people are going to, seek these things out. And there's a degree of respect and courage even that's inherent in the willingness to do so, still in a time of, war on drugs.
I mean, again, like I don't think these things are going away. I mean, retreat centers are gonna keep popping up. People are gonna keep going to the Amazon. They're gonna keep going to the Mazatec Mountains. They're gonna keep going to the Zapotec Mountains in Oaxaca. They're gonna keep going to Costa Rica. They're going to, going to Dharamsala and to Rishikesh in India. All those things are gonna continue happening and probably going to increase more and more as entropy increases and our social and cultural frameworks continue to collapse to some extent. I think people are going to keep seeking for answers and seeking for all sorts of different ideas and inspirations. I think it is very important that we do pay more attention to story, narrative, and discourse. I think it's very important that we get a lot more critical voices involved in these things, not only highlighting risks of iatrogenic damage and so on and so forth, but also, I think there's many dogmas that are kind of like been at the heart of healing culture for a very long time, very individualistic approaches to what it means to be happy and healthy, discourses on root causes and so on. But I think it would be a great thing for practitioners. One thing that I do when I teach a lot of classes in different training courses and all sorts of different things that they invite me to say. One of the things that I oftentimes, students is like, the one thing that I would like, if there's one thing that I would like to transmit, right, or the one thing that I would like not to see is any of you becoming cult leaders. Right? Like, I don't want any of you to be cult leaders. I don't want in the future to see that you're all running a cult, with your own preconceived ideas and a high degree of certainty about ideas that you have no business being certain about. And, conspirituality as a whole is very prone to cultish dynamics. Psychedelics are very inducive towards cult dynamics if they're not properly integrated and there's not a proper process of apprenticeship. There is a process of apprenticeship that requires that very high degree of epistemic humility, but also that willingness to constantly revisit our own assumption, our own stories, our own belief systems, and so on and so forth. And not only that, but constantly revisioning and acknowledging how our own stories, our own beliefs, our own frameworks affect the people that we work with. So, first of all, when we talk about iatrogenic damage in the context of psychedelics, healing culture, conspirituality, don't become a cult leader, most importantly. Secondly, always kind of like be aware and self-critical and self-aware of all the different stories that we carry with you. How do we project that when we work with people? How do we project that in our own experiences? For practitioners, for medicine providers, for retreat center, operators, like a constant, process of self-awareness about those things. what I would like to see personally, I would like to see a much less emphasis on individual healing and transformation, and much more emphasis on how can we actually approach structure, right? How can we actually approach structural issues? How can we actually use psychedelics, not necessarily as, tools of endless self-absorption and self-contemplation, but actually as catalysts for, you know, change, like real change that has material impact on a lot of people, bringing back to the forefront social determinants of health, bringing back to the forefront public health, maybe in a revisited way that doesn't create as much animosity and antagonism with people, but at the same time, just that understanding that actually being happy and healthy is a collective project. And by the end of the day, nobody can be fully happy and healthy unless we're all happy and healthy to some extent. And I think those are the most important things that would be very, if the Oracle at Delphi had described the lintel, know thyself, I think that's very important, know thyself. But I think in modern times, know thyself is not enough. I think in modern times is know thyself, but also, know how embedded you are in all different layers of being and how you're impacted by them and impact them in turn. And how can we always keep one eye looking inwards, doing our work, doing what it is that we need to be better people, but at the same time, one eye outward. Like, we're not ignoring structure, we're not ignoring structural issues, we're not ignoring social, cultural, political, environmental things that affect all of us, and how we can actually have that impact. I think that would be what I would like to see.
Well, count me in, brother. Thank you, Adam. On behalf of those listening, I'd like to offer you a deep bow for your work and your contemplations and your critiques, and for your time with me today. It's been a great honor to be able to speak with you, to be able to listen to what I can see is someone who is clearly walking the walk and talking the talk of epistemic humility. And so I'd like to ask finally for our listeners, how might they find out more about your work, whether on social media, Substack, or elsewhere?
Yeah, I think the starting point for most people would be the Healing from Healing Instagram, which is really, it's kind of like nowadays, it changed a lot through the last 3 or 4 years. Now it's really more focused on humor than critique, even though it's still very critical and skeptical about many of the things. But for a more nuanced and a little bit more in-depth take on the things that I like to showcase in the Instagram page, then definitely the Substack, also called Healing from Healing, and you can follow me both on Instagram and the Substack. And the thesis, I think, is going to be available soonish, so you can just Google my name and it's probably going to pop up. So Instagram page, Healing from Healing, like, follow, comment. And then the Substack really is the project that I'm more interested in now. I haven't really written anything new in a couple of months because I was focused on finishing the doctoral dissertation, but I think that's going to become the platform where mostly I'm going to put up my writings in the future.
Fantastic. Yeah, I look forward to reading your dissertation, Adam. And hopefully by the time the episode is up on the internet, that'll be available, and I'll be putting it in the homework section along with the links to your Instagram and Substack.
Great.
And so once again, Adam, thank you so much deeply for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. To follow up on this episode, check out the homework section on our website at theendoftourism.com. Likewise, you can subscribe and join the conversation at chrischristou.substack.com. That's CHRISCHRISTOU.substack.com. The pod embraces a gift economy model, and by signing up, spreading the word, and supporting us financially, we can ensure that this work continues in a good way. Until next time, farewell, friends.